In 1866, the Indian state formerly known as Orissa, currently Odisha, underwent severe famine during which upwards of 1 million people lost their lives. Major catalysts to this disaster included 30 years of drought on the Deccan Plateau, increased crop exports from India, an indifferent and negligent English aristocracy, and poor land maintenance and farming practices. This was a part of a longer stretch of decades of famine under the British Raj in India and just gives us a glimpse into easily one of the darkest times in Indian history. Our featured artist, William Simpson, born in 1823, died in 1899, was a Scottish artist, war correspondent, and illustrator for the London News who had a knack for documenting global conditions during wartime and disasters, such as his residency in India for roughly 2 decades in the 1850s and 1860s, during which a famine caused by drought and poor policies by the British leadership ran rampant over the ill-prepared Indian people. Here we see the main subject of this video, the representation of one of the most devastating periods in Indian history, known as Famine in India, painted by William Simpson in 1866. This watercolored image on a 9 by 13 piece of woven paper suggests that the initial intention of this artwork was for documentation in a sketchbook of sorts, which would make sense considering that Simpson produced over 700 lithographic works during his time spent in Eastern Europe and Asia. The main issue relating to this famine that we will be discussing and analyzing is the point of view and intention of William Simpson and what exactly he wanted to convey about the famine to his audience. Although he was born into poverty in Glasgow, it seemed like Simpson wasn't attempting to be incredibly sympathetic to the Indian people, who were looked upon as filthy animals compared to the sophisticated Englishmen of the 1800s. Taking in the entire landscape of famine in India, we noticed the little amount of detail in the image, and especially the faces of the suffering, so as to not draw the eye of the viewer to a clearer area. In doing so, the focus is drawn immediately to the larger and darker object, the bull deity. The next aspect the eye picks up, after taking in the grandeur of the sacred Hindu bull, Nandi, is the scattering of women, children, and men who seem to be begging and praying for relief from the famine. Another interesting aspect of the scene depicted is the lack of implied space for the Indian people to escape to. Simpson's choice to show the scene on seemingly the bank of a river suggests a sense of entrapment and nowhere else to turn. This makes sense when thinking about how India couldn't help itself during this famine, and there was very little aid from England, and even reports saying England was not even completely aware of the situation until the bulk of the famine had passed. This suggests a completely dysfunctional lack of communication between the colony and England. To make matters worse, the main mode of intercontinental communication was the telegraph. This technology allowed for egregious misunderstandings and failure to communicate important information quickly. Delving more into the context that the image hints at, we see that this could very easily be seen as unethical. Firstly, Simpson's choice to depict the Indians praying to a Hindu deity immediately segregates them and assumes that they have the same spirituality. It could be possible that this was not his intention, as values and society were much different in 1860s India. However, there can't help but be the sense of an us versus them dynamic, separating himself from the scene as an onlooker. This is increasingly intriguing, considering most of the English citizens at the time likely had little regard for the Indian famines, or were just kept mostly in the dark about how severe the circumstances were at the time. After doing much research on this subject, I've concluded that Simpson's creation of Famine in India could very easily be viewed as both ethical and unethical, solely depending on the age in which it is being viewed. There was no direct harm or unwanted publicity that resulted from the creation and publication of this image because of the generality and anonymity of the victims. Since there's obviously a large subset of Indians who practice Hinduism, this doesn't have to be taken down the path of segregation. At the time, considering that Simpson documented tragedy and death for so long as his main occupation under the British Crown, it makes sense that he was desensitized to much of the darkness humanity has to face. Simpson's audience, when he created this representation, were most likely even less heartbroken than he, being protected by his position as a voyeur, and not a part of the disaster itself. In the current age, there would be much critique and dissection of the morality of depicting a general group of people during a time in history where most of the world was blind to the happenings of Southeast Asia.